Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Andrew Johnson, Part 5, Civil War Military Governor of Tennessee. We stopped last time in 1862. The United States was at war, civil war, the North against the South, the United States of America against the Confederate States of America. And Andrew Johnson, although he was from a state that had seceded, that had joined the Confederacy, he remained loyal to the United States, and as a result, he was rewarded for his loyalty by being named the military governor of Tennessee. And he was in Nashville, the capital of Tennessee, during this time, and the war was ongoing. The Confederates' most talented cavalry leaders were Nathan Bedford Forrest and John Hunt Morgan, who conducted raids near Nashville. Nashville was under duress, under the threat of Confederate attacks, although the Union had taken it. So during this time, these Confederate cavalry leaders cut rail lines, blew up bridges, so sometimes Nashville was out of touch, and there was always a danger that the Confederates would take it. July 13th, Nathan Bedford Forrest attacked Murfreesboro, Tennessee. On July 23rd, Forrest was 1 mile from Nashville. This was a dangerous time. Andrew Johnson remained calm. He threatened to destroy houses of secessionists if Bedford attacked. Again, in July, Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest retook Murfreesboro, Tennessee. President Abraham Lincoln had this to say about Andrew Johnson. He said that he was true, valuable, and indispensable to the United States in Tennessee. In August, Nashville was unprotected by the U.S. Army. Andrew Johnson remained cool and calm. There was speculation that Union General Buell was sympathetic to the South, that his heart was not in the battle. Andrew Johnson said, quote, "May God save my country from some of the generals who have been conducting this war." On July 29th, Nathan Bedford Forrest retreated away from Nashville, and it was believed because of the threats Andrew Johnson had made against the homes of wealthy known Confederate sympathizers. Andrew Johnson sent a letter to President Abraham Lincoln requesting the removal of Captain O.D. Greene, who refused his request to defend Nashville. President Lincoln responded and said that Johnson was asking for command of the West, and he said, quote, "I do not suppose you desire this." So President Lincoln suggested that Andrew Johnson communicate with General Henry Halleck directly his thoughts. President Lincoln had this to say, again, about Andrew Johnson, quote, "A true and valuable man, indispensable to us in Tennessee." In August, Confederate General Morgan cut the railroad line and cut Nashville from rail communications with the North. It was a dangerous time in Nashville. The Confederates were in retreat in eastern Tennessee. Andrew Johnson biographer Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, "In the crisis during the late summer and early fall of 1862, Andrew Johnson was a rock of firmness." Andrew Johnson did not want to make war on Confederate women. He was more lenient than his talk, harsh words, but he was forgiving. He supervised the building of a railroad connecting Nashville to the Tennessee River. A big issue became slavery. President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation in September, which would take effect in January 1863, and this would free slaves in the Confederate States. Andrew sensed that the mood of the country was changing regarding slavery. In the middle of September to early November, General Rosecrans arrived. Nashville had been totally isolated. Nathan Bedford Forrest said that the destruction of Nashville would be, quote, "a cheap price to pay if they could catch Andy Johnson." A reporter named Samuel Glenn said that, quote, "the coolness and calmness of Andrew Johnson amid these trying times are beyond all praise." Andrew Johnson spent most of his time at the Capitol. He set an example of confidence. The Nashville Dispatch newspaper said, quote, that Andy Johnson, if the rebels retook Nashville, they will find his remains under the ruin of the Capitol. There was a story told to painter Frank Carpenter that Andrew Johnson believed that General Buell would evacuate Nashville. He was in despair. It looked like the Confederates were going to take Nashville. His friend, Granville Moody, a Methodist minister, came to visit. And according to the story, Johnson said, quote, "Moody, we are sold out. General Buell is a traitor. He is going to evacuate the city, and in 48 hours we shall be in the hands of the rebels." So Andrew Johnson asked Moody to pray. The two men prayed. Later, Johnson said, quote, "Moody, I feel better." And after a short time, he said, quote, "Oh, Moody, I don't want you to think I have become a religious man because I asked you to pray. I am sorry to say it, but I am not. But I do believe in Almighty God, and I believe also in the Bible. And if I say, 'Damned me if Nashville shall be surrendered.'" And Nashville was not surrendered. But Nashville, Tennessee continued to be in danger. Andrew Johnson and Unionists were subject to the ill-disguised sneers and taunts of Union haters in Nashville. And President Lincoln finally decided that General Buell had to go, and General William Rosecrans replaced Buell. Rosecrans was slender, handsome, optimistic, organized, and disciplined and diligent, and Murfreesboro, Tennessee, was retaken. General Buell had told Andrew Johnson that Nashville had no military value and should have been evacuated 3 months earlier. On October 12th, Andrew Johnson's family arrived: Eliza, his son Charles, daughter Mary, her husband Daniel Stover. The New York Herald reporter Samuel Glenn wrote, quote, "Even the governor's Roman sternness was overcome" by the arrival of his family. General Rosecrans lifted the siege of Nashville in November. The Battle of Murfreesboro was a Union victory. Eastern Tennessee would not be liberated till the fall of 1863 and parts later. Eliza, Andrew's wife, had traveled through the battle lines to Nashville, had a tough time because Andrew Johnson, her husband, was hated in the South. Eliza was in poor health. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest met Eliza and said that he would not allow to pass even Jesus Christ. So he said, "No, you cannot pass." However, Governor Isham Harris, who had been the governor, the civil governor, who became the Confederate governor, who was, of course, no longer in Nashville, but he still had authority with the Confederate military, and he allowed her to pass, so she arrived in Nashville. February of 1863, Andrew Johnson traveled to Washington, D.C. He asked for help in liberating eastern Tennessee, where his home of Greenville was. He gave speeches in Indiana, New York, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and in Washington, D.C., in Indianapolis, Indiana, Cincinnati, Ohio, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Baltimore, Maryland, and at the Capitol. President Lincoln met with Andrew Johnson and talked with him about the idea of having black troops in Tennessee. In other words, freed slaves that would join the Union Army. In the summer of 1863, Andrew Johnson came out with a public stance against slavery. His wife Eliza continued to be sick. In December of 1862, Eliza had traveled to Vevey, Indiana for a cure. In March of 1863, Andrew gave speeches in Philadelphia, New York City, Baltimore. On March 31st, he gave a speech in the House and the Capitol Gallery, and the folks said, "Give it to them, Andy." In April, Andrew Johnson and General Rosecrans, by this time, had a good relationship. General Rosecrans could see that Andrew Johnson's son Robert was an alcoholic. He spoke with him. He was under his command, and General Rosecrans was very good to him. He was very kind, patient, and diplomatic. And Andrew Johnson appreciated the consideration General Rosecrans had for his troubled son Robert, and he said, quote, "Please accept my thanks for the gentle admonition you gave my son and the kind manner in which it was done." Now, Andrew had ongoing elbow trouble from that train accident. His sons, Robert and Charles, were both drinking. Charles, in April, was a Union Army surgeon. He fell from a horse and died. Oh, very tragic. He lost his son. Robert was in conflict with his superiors in the military, so Andrew Johnson recalled Robert to Nashville. His son Frank was in school in Louisville, Kentucky. Andrew returned to Nashville on May 30th, and a large crowd came out to greet him. 1863, there were victories at Gettysburg and Pennsylvania and Vicksburg, Mississippi in July, major turning point in the war. In August, Andrew Johnson gave a speech and called slavery, quote, a cancer on our society. In September, General Burnside captured Knoxville, Tennessee, temporarily liberated Greenville. Andrew was hesitant regarding black troops, but then he saw that they performed well and changed his mind and supported the use of black troops in the Civil War. And eventually, 20,000 African-American troops were raised in Tennessee. So Andrew had this new position on slavery. This was complicating his efforts to establish a civilian government, alienating some powerful Confederate sympathizers. He was being pressured to have elections. In May, in May of 1862, they had an election for judge. A secessionist, Turner S. Forster, won. Governor Johnson gave him a commission and then arrested Foster for disloyalty and then appointed his rival. Biographer Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, it was not a hopeful beginning. Not a hopeful beginning in changing from a military to a civilian government, which they needed to do. By July of 1863, Andrew Johnson's friends, they wanted him to hold elections. Andrew hesitated. The Union supporters in eastern Tennessee were under Confederate control, and election success was doubtful. Andrew freed his own slaves in 1863 and offered them employment as house servants, which they accepted. Also that summer, General Ulysses S. Grant came to Nashville, Tennessee. He made a joint public appearance with Andrew Johnson, Governor Johnson. At that appearance, Andrew Johnson gave a speech, and Ulysses S. Grant said, quote, it was long, and I was in torture while he was delivering it, fearing something would be expected of me in response. I was relieved, however, the people assembled having heard enough. Since Grant was not a big speech maker, and of course Johnson really was. That was his favorite thing to do, giving speeches. Andrew Johnson's home in Greenville had been taken by the rebel troops and defaced with graffiti. In his bedroom, they had written on the wall, Andrew Johnson, the old traitor. September of 1863, Union General Burnside took Knoxville, Tennessee without resistance, and eastern Tennessee was liberated. Andrew Johnson was ecstatic. The Battle of Chickamauga, 16,000 Union troops died. General Rosecrans' days were numbered, and Ulysses S. Grant replaced Rosecrans with George Thomas. October 20th of 1863, General Grant was back in Nashville. Andrew Johnson called Grant, quote, Napoleon or Julius Caesar himself. Ulysses S. Grant reorganized the soldiers at Chattanooga, Tennessee, and defeated the Confederates there. By October of 1863, all of Tennessee was clear of Confederate troops. President Lincoln was pressuring Andrew Johnson to hold regular elections. And President Lincoln said to Andrew Johnson, quote, I see that you have declared in favor of emancipation, for which may God bless you. However, Andrew Johnson continued to hesitate regarding elections. The rumor was that he wanted to keep power. December 8th, President Lincoln had his amnesty proclamation, and he said that there could be the establishment of a state government in southern states if 10% of the population would take a loyalty oath. Then there would be amnesty. December of 1863, President Lincoln summoned Andrew Johnson to Washington, D.C. He was considering him to be his vice presidential candidate in 1864. Andrew Johnson was serious, grim, totally devoted to the Union, similar to Ulysses S. Grant. Afterwards, he returned to Nashville, and in a speech, he told the slave owners to free their slaves and hire them as paid laborers. Andrew Johnson's idea was that the voters needed to take an oath that they supported the government and desired the defeat of the Confederacy. January 26 of 1864, Andrew Johnson had a proclamation regarding holding an election in March. There would be regular elections for justice of the peace, sheriff, constable, and clerks of court. And in this oath, the voters had to say that they desired a defeat of the Confederacy. All voters had to do this. Now, the Unionists supposedly were offended by this, so there was conflict. They didn't want to apparently make this oath, and they could not resolve it. January 21st, the Tennessee legislature had an amendment to the state constitution passed abolishing slavery. Tennessee was the only Confederate state to voluntarily abolish slavery. Andrew Johnson continued to risk his life during these times. March 5th, there was an election in Tennessee for various offices. There was a low turnout. It was boycotted by many people and ignored. In June of 1864, the Republicans had their National Union Party convention. Really, it was the Republican convention in a presidential election year. President Lincoln was nominated for a second term, and Andrew Johnson was nominated as his vice presidential candidate. The Cleveland Daily Leader said that Andrew Johnson's supported the Union with, quote, a fervent and devoted love, through storm and danger, enduring much, suffering much. Andrew Johnson had been a strong contender for the presidency, so he was a Democrat, but running on the Republican ticket because they wanted to have it was like a unity ticket. Republicans wanted to attract war Democrats to support President Lincoln in the election. In other words, Democrats who supported the Union, and so they were open to the possibility of having a Democrat for vice president. And President Lincoln supported the idea as well. Andrew Johnson was popular in the North. And at the June convention, of course, he was nominated along with President Lincoln. The Louisville Press had this to say about Andrew Johnson, quote, no man has labored more earnestly in the cause of government than he has. His name is inseparably connected with the history of this mighty struggle for the maintenance of the Union and free government. President Lincoln said, quote, Andy Jackson, I think, is a good man. So this was the Republican Union Convention, and Andrew Johnson was nominated for vice president. And then he started traveling the country, giving campaign speeches, his favorite activity, giving speeches and traveling. And Andrew Johnson said, quote, what will the aristocrats do with a rail splitter for a president and a tailor for vice president? His nomination as vice president was very popular in the North and in the border states. On June 9th, there was a massive crowd in Nashville outside the St. Cloud Hotel celebrating Andrew Johnson's nomination for vice president. A band and musicians, the 18th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. Now, in the 1864 campaign, one of the slogans was, the Union forever. Hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitors, up with the stars. Abraham Lincoln had strong support in New England. Now, his vice president had been Hannibal Hamlin, a native of Maine, and it was believed that he would not help the ticket. So that's why he was taken off and replaced by Andrew Johnson, who it was believed would help in Tennessee, Missouri, and Kentucky. The New York Times said about Andrew Johnson, he had a, quote, far stronger hold upon the great popular heart of the North than he could have had he been born in the North. Thaddeus Stevens, one of the U.S. senators, said, quote, can't you find a candidate for vice president in the United States without going down to one of those damn rebel provinces to pick one up? So Thaddeus Stevens didn't support Johnson on the ticket. Now there was no tradition of that at that time, candidates campaigning, but Andrew did campaign, gave speeches in Indiana. He said that Black Americans, African Americans, should be given a chance to work out their own destiny. Andrew Johnson believed in mercy for young Confederates. He asked President Lincoln to pardon young John, who had committed murder against a Union soldier, and President Lincoln offered that pardon. There were requests for Andrew Johnson to speak in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, and New England, and of course he fulfilled those requests. The Democrats called President Lincoln a, quote, a rail-splitting buffoon, and Andrew Johnson, quote, a boorish tailor. Biographer Gary Bullard wrote, quote, for Andrew Johnson, this was indeed a great time to be alive, and he relished the applause and cheers of the Northerners who had come to idolize him. In the election, now the states didn't all vote at the same time. There was earlier elections in Indiana, and President Lincoln won, and it was believed with Andrew Johnson's help. On October 24th, there was a torchlight parade of the freedmen, the freed slaves that reached the Capitol in Nashville. They called for Governor Johnson to speak to the crowd, which he did, to this crowd of African Americans. And Andrew Johnson said, quote, looking at this vast crowd of colored people and reflecting through what storm of persecution they are compelled to pass, I am almost induced to wish that as in the days of old, a Moses might arise who should lead them safely to their promised land of freedom and happiness. And someone in the crowd said, quote, you are our Moses. Andrew Johnson responded, quote, God no doubt has prepared somewhere an instrument for the great work he designs to perform in behalf of the outraged people. And in due time, your leader will come forth. Your Moses will be revealed to you. The crowd said, quote, we want no Moses but you. Andrew Johnson said, quote, well then, humble and unworthy as I am, if no other better shall be found, I will indeed be your Moses and lead you through the Red Sea of war and bondage to a fairer future of liberty and peace. He didn't really fulfill that promise. Now, this speech caused a sensation, and the Nashville Dispatch reported that Andrew Johnson was not well. During this time, the summer of 1864, there were Union victories at Mobile Bay, Atlanta, in the Shenandoah Valley. Greenville was liberated temporarily. Confederate General John Hunt Morgan was killed a few blocks from Andrew Johnson's house. And in the national election, the presidential election, President Abraham Lincoln and his vice presidential nominee, Andrew Johnson, won. President Lincoln won Tennessee. The voter turnout was slight. There was a Democratic boycott, and the Confederate military was interfering. Andrew Johnson wanted to end the military government in Tennessee. Andrew Johnson hoped that the black people of the South could become self-sufficient and achieve economic success. In December, Confederate General John Bell Hood threatened Nashville. Union General George Thomas attacked and defeated the Confederates in a two-day battle December 16th. By December 30th, the Confederate Army was out of Tennessee. In December, Andrew Johnson gave a speech to 4,000 black residents in Nashville at his Cedar Street residence. And when he said, quote, I warn you, my colored friends, to avoid the folly of which some black men and women, and I am sorry to add, some white ones too, are guilty of working 6 days industriously and then spending all your wages in a drunken revel. Congress refused to accept the Tennessee vote. In December, Confederate General John B. Hood had invaded Tennessee. There was the Battle of Nashville, we mentioned, major Union victory. There was a convention regarding having a civilian government in Tennessee, elections scheduled for January of 1865. Tennessee was completely free of the Confederate Army. An amendment to abolish slavery and annul the Tennessee Declaration of Independence happened, and there was popular ratification. That was there was a popular ratification scheduled for February of 1865. In January, Andrew Johnson spoke at that convention in Tennessee, quote, "You took me by the hand when a poor and friendless boy and led me to honor, and by God's blessing in the close of my little political career, I shall try to be your friend still." Andrew Johnson sent a telegram to President Lincoln and said that the voters of Tennessee had abolished slavery, and President Lincoln said, or Andrew Johnson said, quote, "Thank God that the tyrant's rod has been broken." On February 11th, Andrew Johnson was ill. He stressed the need for approval of public amendments to the state constitution. He resigned as governor of Tennessee and as brigadier general, preparing to become vice president of the United States. He sent his resignation to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton, according to historians, was treacherous, mendacious, and unprincipled. On February 25th, the black people of Nashville presented Andrew Johnson with a beautiful gold watch in recognition of, quote, his untiring energy in the cause of freedom. Andrew traveled to Washington, D.C., getting ready to be inaugurated as vice president. He was in poor health. His family stayed behind in Tennessee. On Inauguration Day in 1865, Andrew Johnson had been sick. The night before, he drank many glasses of whiskey. On the day of the inauguration, he drank 3 glasses of whiskey, and then when it came time for him to be inaugurated as vice president and for him to give a speech, Hans L. Treff, was described what happened, quote, "Glorying in his rise from the masses, he pointed out that all who were sitting before him owed their positions to the people." And then he said in his speech at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., Andrew Johnson said, quote, "I will say to you, Mr. Secretary Seward," now the cabinet was there, President Lincoln's cabinet, "I will say to you, Mr. Secretary Seward, and to you, Mr. Secretary Stanton, and to you, Mr. Secretary, who is the Secretary of the Navy?" Someone whispered, "Mr. Wells." "And to you, Mr. Secretary Wells, I would say you all derive your power from the people." The audience was horrified by this because Andrew Johnson was drunk, very unfortunately. And of course, President Lincoln was inaugurated for the second time. And of course, backing up to Andrew Johnson's speech, he always said he liked the word plebeian, which goes back to the Roman Empire, and it means the common people. And he kept saying in his speech, "I, though a plebeian boy." A Democratic senator said that if President Lincoln died and was replaced by Andrew Johnson, the country would sink to a depth not seen, quote, "since the Roman emperor made his horse a consul." That would be Caligula, who had his horse elected to the Senate. There was a story in the New York Herald that Andrew Johnson, traveling from Tennessee to Washington, D.C., that he didn't skip Bourbon County, Kentucky, and the story amused President Lincoln. Zachariah Chandler said, quote, "The inauguration went off very well, except that the vice president was too drunk to perform his duties and disgraced himself and the Senate by making a drunken, foolish speech." The New York World, regarding Andrew Johnson, said, quote, "Even Caligula's horse was respectable." So this is a big scandal. His kind of spoiled or marred President Lincoln's inauguration, having his vice president inaugurated in a drunken state. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon Chase, said that Andrew Johnson was in Washington, D.C. after 3 years of Civil War service as military governor in Tennessee, in which his life was in daily danger. And Chase said, quote, "I honor him greatly as one who risked everything for his convictions. There are few who do." President Lincoln said, quote, "I have known Andy Johnson for many years. He made a bad slip the other day, but Andy ain't a drunkard." March 4th of 1865 was the only time Andrew Johnson was drunk in public. He was debilitated by disease, and that's partly really why he was drinking, trying to feel better, and he went too far and got drunk. Now, Andrew, after being inaugurated, wanted to go to Tennessee. Richmond, Virginia had fallen, but he stayed in Washington. On April 6th, Andrew went to Richmond to see the ruins of the fallen capital after the Union Army had taken it. Well, that concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time with part 6 of the fascinating story of Andrew Johnson. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.